Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. We're excited to talk a little bit more about climate justice, have an open and have an open dialogue, have some open conversation. Please feel free to use the chat. I am Ellonda Williams. I am the Director of Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at B-Lab, and I'm joined by my colleague here, Janae Lloyd.
Hi, Ellonda, and hi, everyone. I'm Janae Lloyd, the Director of Impact for World Centric. We're another B Corp providing food service packaging, all plant-based, and we donate 25% of our profits to social and environmental causes.
Thank you. Yeah, so we're here for another 25 minutes to ask any burning questions that you all might have. We can have a little bit of dialogue. I see people joining in. If you want to come up on stage with Janae and I and chat, feel free to hop in. I think there's some directions there in the chat. We've got one first question for you all, kind of coming off of our conversation, is who should pay for the cost of climate or environmental justice? They're used interchangeably. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Environmental justice is defined by the Environmental Protection Agency as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, respect to development, implementation, enforcement, or environmental laws, regulations, and policies. It's a lot of jargon, but it's about people, and it's about helping them have a better quality of life. And whenever those things are impeded upon because of the environment, who should pay? Janae, do you have thoughts?
Yes, I have thoughts. I think polluters should pay, and we hear that a lot in the news. And I have to agree, because polluters are not only polluting the earth, but they're violating human rights. So, for example, we've seen what ExxonMobil has done, not just in the Amazon, but all over the world. And yeah, they should have to pay for what they're doing.
Yeah, and some polluters contribute more than others, right? Organizations, businesses, right? So, and I like the way that you say that around polluters. Like, when you think about it, we're all polluters, right? We all contribute to the system, and so we should equitably be working to upturn and overturn the ill effects of that system that we all are contributing to. And those, such as organizations and businesses who are some of the biggest contributors, should have to pay more, right? Should have to give more. Feel free to join in on the Q&A or in the chat. We're taking a look at both of those areas. Should anyone want to join in or have a question or a comment that you'd like to share or want to noodle on or dialogue with us about a little bit more? Let's see. Climate justice, environmental justice talks a lot about inequities, right? I think it's rooted in the ideology that we start off with systems that were built inequitably. So the outcomes are not going to be felt equitably, essentially. So whenever we're taking into consideration climate and environmental injustices that happen, these things are they exacerbate existing issues and problems. What are your thoughts on like exacerbating issues around how climate justice can help kind of level the playing field on things that might be exacerbated?
Well, I think when we look at issues like, and I hope I'm going to understand and answer your question correctly, but when we look at issues like pollution, we see these issues that become much larger, right? The human rights violations, the ripple effect. And so when you try to address them through a climate justice lens, you're not just looking at one area. You're not just looking at the environment, but you're looking at the human and the social side too. And so that's why I think the ability for people to try to take this more holistic view is so critical. I hope, I think I interpreted your question correctly, but I'm curious.
Yeah. It's a loose conversation, right? Systems that have been built are built in ways in which they are not equitably distributed. Resources are not equitably distributed. Things are not readily accessible in the same way globally, for different people. And so when we think about the outcomes of environmental injustice, when you're looking at like food deserts or pollution in poor and impoverished communities, the outcomes are already inequitable. And so environmental injustice exacerbates this, right? And so you've given us a couple examples of ways in which things just continue to be further hard felt by those who experience marginalized, spaces, or those who have marginalized identities,
Yeah, especially if the government isn't recognizing that too. So like in the video we watched of Alex, he has this really powerful line in there that, basically said that we're the first for the government to extract from and the last for them to provide resources for. And so like that is why it's so important that they have the legal support to actually fight against the government for their rights that are being violated.
Yeah, that one of the questions that I had was, let me see here. Environmental justice may be classified as the responsibility of the government, right, to ensure equitable access to healthy living environments. Do you think that the government is holding up its end of the bargain in relation to environmental justice? I could guess your answer.
Not so far. I mean, that's what we see in environmental racism, right? Like where polluters are allowed to build, and everything comes back to money and the power that is within money. And so I think government has a long, long way to go. Even with Build Back Better, there's still so much, there's such a huge gap between the dream and the reality of where we are and what it takes to achieve that sort of equitable improvement in environmental justice for more people.
Yeah, for sure. Why do you think that, why do you think it's about justice, right? Like I get asked this question all the time, like why should we now be having conversations about environmental justice? Why not net zero? Why not carbon offsets? Why not? And not to say that either or is more or less important, but there is sometimes a push for, why are we wanting to shift the conversation? What do you think, Janae? Like, why do you think that justice is really considered the central issue to all of climate change?
That's an interesting question, because I think depending on who you talk to, it can be semantics, right? Like environmental justice is not a new thing. We just hope that it's being brought more to the forefront. There have been champions of environmental justice forever. And so what we're hoping to do is shifting this conversation, like against net zero, it's very much based on carbon, right? And there's not the people element to it. And so for me, climate justice involves the impact on people into the conversation, because even with carbon reduction programs and carbon offset projects, you can still be causing harm within those if your end goal is to just get the cheapest offset possible or do the littlest amount possible. Mm-hmm. And climate justice really makes you consider the impacts of those actions. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I'm curious for you, like our work is really focused. We do a little bit of work in the US, but it's really focused on communities with extreme poverty and protecting Indigenous land rights. But your work is really focused here in the US and globally, but I'm curious your perspective, because it's a little bit of a different lens.
Wow. My perspective on why justice is the center?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm a big proponent for systems change, right? And I think that what we are living in right now is the outcome of the systems that have already been in place, right? So inequities, police brutality, environmental injustice, racism, right? These are the outcomes of the systems that were built for any of us nowadays have got here, right? So we didn't have a say in it. We just came to be in this system. And now we are trying to right that system. And at the end of the day, people make decisions, People make choices. People, right? People pull the levers that make societies go. People pull the levers that make capitalism, that drive capitalism on a day-to-day basis. It's about human beings that wake up every day and live in a society collectively. And so it's hard for me to understand how we are going to create any sort of long-term system change without having conversations with individual people and changing hearts, minds, mindsets, and the individual people. So when they get in the room, right, to make the decisions, that they're making the decisions with different considerations in mind than the considerations that were in mind when the system was created. So that's why I think that justice really is about, you say, doing the right thing, but globally, that is going to change. I say EDI, JEDI, racism, inclusivity, these conversations, while across the globe are issues that happen everywhere, they show up very differently locally. So it is a global issue that is realized locally in very different ways. And so we cannot have conversations and make decisions and change the outcome unless we actually think about the people that are affected by the systems that have been created. Change those systems, and then you change the outcomes for those people. It's very cyclical to me. And so it's hard to see how we're going to get there without really focusing on justice and humans and the people.
Mm-hmm. That kind of reminds me in a little way of the first question you were asking about, like, who should pay? And it's easy for us. I think, like a lot of times we think about our individual selves, like, okay, I need to recycle more or do these things. But really it's everyone, right? Like there's the individual action, and then like the make polluters pay, the biggest polluters need to pay, which is so true. But really, like you're saying, the hearts and minds of individuals cause that collective action. And so while, your own reusable bag may not save the planet, us all like coming together to create better movements do impact it, which is, B Lab is such a great example of that, right? Of companies coming together to try to create change through like a network of greater strength in some ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The collective community is like so important. And so that's why we can't single out any side of the spectrum, right? You have to be able to bring all of those folks together and all of those kind of sides together. I love what you're thinking, what you said. People say that like, oh, even when it comes to like voting, folks are like, some individuals like, why should I vote? It's one vote amongst all of these votes. Why should I recycle? My one plastic bag that I threw away, or like you said, my reusable bag is not going to be the thing that saves the planet. Not yours individually. But if you make that choice, and then your neighbors make that choice, and then your block makes that choice, and then your neighborhood makes that choice, and then your city, and then your state, and so forth and so on, that's how you make that change. So while the long-term systemic change does not happen right away, the immediate change has to happen in the people and in the individuals first, before we can actually really see it realized. The list did like this really cool survey, and it talked about one of the questions on the survey was, do you think that environmental justice is elitist? And I thought that was a really cool question to think about. So now I'm going to pose that to you. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, and I might want to know more of like the context of their question. I'll have to look up that survey. But
it's LYS. It's an odd name, yeah. LYS.
I guess in some ways it is, because if you have a choice, then you might have a privilege, where in other areas, environmental justice doesn't get to be a choice if your livelihood is threatened. And so in that way, it might be, I'll have to like think on that a little bit more.
I like your thinking around choice. I align with that very much so. I think that when we think about privilege, especially now, you know what I mean? Like when we talk a lot about race and racism has come up a lot in environmental justice, you know, there's a connection there. And when we have those conversations, we talk a lot about privilege and how that is related to race, you know, and so you hear white privilege, and that's become this very, very linked thing. But I think that I like to push people to push privilege as it relates to your choices, right? It doesn't always, maybe you have different choices because of your race or your ethnicity, and perhaps you have different choices because of your abilities. However, the more choices you have, the more privilege you have, regardless of where you are. So I think it's important for us to all remember we all have privilege, some more than others. Sometimes the privilege changes. I might go in one space and my privilege diminishes greatly, and I walk into another space and I hold that privilege again. So privilege really is about choice. And if you have the choice on whether or not this is something that you can care about, you have a privilege. And you know, we've heard the phrase before, you know, when you have a lot, a lot is required of you. You know, you have a privilege, it comes with some responsibility. And if you have a lot of privilege, then you should have more responsibility. One question. Oh, love that. Thank you very much. There's a question in our chat. Let's see. Love that. Oh, look at that. I'm so sorry, Emily. We got so deep into our conversation. I missed this. Thank you for calling us out. Okay. How do we shift and encourage companies to provide help in areas that are urgent and even a better fit for them to change rather than hopping on a trend? Performative action. Shift and encourage companies.
One of the things I think about is like the intention the company was started with from the beginning. And so, for example, if you're a social enterprise, you might want to be able to, versus jumping on a trend, continue to dig into what you were set out to do and have expertise in and can create a larger impact. Now, if you are not a social enterprise and your, you know, ultimate goal is bottom line, then maybe the question is like, how can we use those trends to create more sustained change or more long-lasting change for those companies? Yeah, that's where my mind first goes. But what do you think, Ellonda?
Yeah, I think that's a good start, right? Shift and encourage companies to provide help in areas that are urgent. So I think it's, for one, are you having the conversations about what is urgent, and are you aligned on what is urgent, right? I had a conversation in a meeting earlier today around sometimes perspectives change what's important. And so what are we saying is important, and how are we considering what is important, and who you ask is gonna vary. But let's just pretend and assume you're aligned on what's important, and you're trying to get your organization to shift into thinking that. I think it really is no magic like dust that you can sprinkle. You're gonna have to have some conversations. We have to have conversations with boards, with leaderships, with CEOs, with directors, with folks that are making the decisions. If you're having a hard time getting your voice heard, I suggest, you know, reaching out to your people and culture, your HR. Maybe we can get some impromptu questions and asking people in the organization what's important. It's really about shifting the mindset. You've got to get that shift. And so tying it to people and the negative outcomes are really, really helpful. We've got somebody coming in, and I'm excited about that. Oh, Emily, you've got a lot of really great questions. We're going to hop over and invite Cheryl in, and then I think we'll have some time to maybe look again at some of your other comments around sustainability and trends. Cheryl, we're going to invite you up. Cheryl, I'm not sure if you left or if you're around, but I don't see you.
Maybe real quick, a follow-up on the question that Emily had foremost might be like, in order to create change within your company, one of the things I think is valuable is to understand how leadership is influenced. And that could be through storytelling, or it could be through data. And so having both storytelling and evidence to support your approach is really important. So for example, when we look at different interventions for extreme poverty, there are times where looking at how lives are impacted is really important, but then also looking at the analytics behind, what are the livelihood improvements over time, and is there data to support this intervention?
Mm-hmm. I was looking to see if I can invite Cheryl to the video call. Cheryl, we invite you back up. You're more than welcome to come and join us. You just have to hit your video, I think, or at least your audio, so that we can hear from you. But yeah, let's go back to our Q&A. I love that what you said about storytelling. +1 on that. Storytelling goes really far, right? And sometimes just inviting folks to have the conversation with leadership, and backing that, as Janae said, with data is really, really helpful to get that shift. And then tying that in. I love, again, what you're talking about, trends, right? Like, trends are something that in business we were told to follow. Like, you follow the trends, you go with the motion of the ocean, so to speak. You do what everyone is doing and go in that direction. But I think when it comes to justice of any kind, right, oftentimes it's not. Sometimes it's making a stance and going in the opposite direction, and making a choice not to be performative. So what I encourage organizations to do is, I understand we all want to make a stance and we want to have a say. Try to control your excitement to make a stance or make a comment or to say something without a commitment, without showing performance. What are you going to do? Not being performative just for show, but hey, we have a stance. We believe in this. We think that this is important. And because of this, this is now what we are going to do. This is now what we are planning. This is now our commitment. And then create some accountability mechanisms around that. Start small. Sometimes organizations get really excited about something huge. It has to be this campaign and this. Start small. It's okay to start small. And you see that once you get a little bit of a shift in thinking, then it gives you traction to keep moving forward. Let's see. Last question, and I think it's just about out of time. So if you have a minute or two, you can respond. Janae, how do you approach the attitude that individual actions don't mean much compared to the impact that corporations and the government have on climate change? It's a good question to end on.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's related to what we were just talking about, where, corporations and government are made up of people. And so that is where I think the individual actions come into play, because if we look at the long term, even for those who have children, those are the future of government and corporations. And so what are the individual actions we're taking to impact that? And also collective action. Like, we know that small groups can make a huge influence on the world. And so I think that while the biggest polluters do need to pay and be held responsible for their actions, and we also know that like a few people own the most wealth, there are these, it doesn't, I think, provide an excuse for anyone to opt out of not doing what they can. I mean, we know from the IPCC report that just came out that there needs to be drastic action taken for us to save our planet. And so it means not just corporations and governments being held accountable, but also our own lifestyle choices to align with that.
Yeah, 100%. I like that. And I don't know. How do you approach the attitude, right? I think it's all about perspective and just reminding folks that that's the case, right? It's all about perspective. Everything is not meant to be compared, right? That's another thing that in businesses, it's something that, compare this to this. There's a place and a time. Whenever you typically make a comparison, whenever you want to try to highlight difference, or if you're trying to go from one point to another point. I would never be able to compare to a governmental agency or a corporation, right? And so those two things should just never be compared, because it's never gonna. There's no equality there. But what I think is important is just to elevate some of the things that Janae just mentioned around, small groups coming together have historically made some of the largest impacts globally that we've seen. And so everyone has a part to play, and just say, this is my part, and if everyone plays the part that they're to play, then we'll get where we're trying to go. And there is no small part or larger part. If that's your part. And as a human and as an individual, that's the most that you can do. But as a corporation or as a governmental or agency, we want them to do as much as they can do as well. And if everyone kind of maximizes those efforts, I think that we'll see a lot of systemic change for a lot of people in the short term, preferably.
Absolutely. And there's a really great, there's some great studies done and information out there about how in order to create social movements, you need all different sorts of players, right? And that means that even if you don't see yourself as someone who could be like an outspoken advocate, there's still a role to play, right? Like we need artists, we need change makers, we need people who are just willing to have conversations with their family members, and we need philanthropists too, so all the people who are on the front lines, like Alex and the way Orani, these people, even if maybe you can't be out championing in the street or with them, fighting for their forests alongside them, a lot of us do have resources to be able to fund that. And for people who are interested in, supporting financially some of that work, I did put a link in at the very top of the chat. But I think, it's easy to feel overwhelmed and then feel paralyzed overwhelmed by what to do about what's going on. And like, okay, I can't make a difference. And so you just feel frozen, but really there's something for everyone to be able to do, to take action, to, contribute.
100%. And comparison is the thief of joy. I've heard that. And I think it's also a way to just kind of like make you feel like you're not doing enough. And I think that is a mentality that we should be able to get away from, grace and kindness, and everyone has a part, and that's no matter how big or small. 2 minutes left. I found something that was really cool. Some concepts around environmental justice. If you've gotten nothing else out of our panel, which I hope you have, and you've joined us and watched us have a little bit of dialogue and shared in with your questions and answers, walking away reminding yourself of some fundamental concepts of environmental justice, and I hope to just fully demystify and kind of clarify what we're talking about. Environmental justice: avoid and minimize or mitigate disproportionately high and adverse human health or environmental effects, including social and environment and economic effects on minority populations and low-income populations, to ensure the full and fair participation by all potentially affected communities in the transportation decision-making processes, or all environmentally related processes, not just transportation, and to prevent the denial of, or reduction in, or significant delay in the receipt of benefits to minority populations, low-income populations, populations that are across the globe, everywhere, right? It is about humans. It is about people. It is about helping them gain access and have equal access or equitable access to resources. And so hopefully, learning a little bit more today makes things a little bit more clear. It's not this scary thing, but it is something that we all can play a part of and assist with. And Janae, thank you so much for sharing those resources where folks can play their part and do something different if you're available to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. I put another link in the chat that takes you to just some slides about ways you can take action. And there's a variety of ways to do that, whether it's supporting Indigenous rights group or divesting from the banks that are driving climate change. There's a bunch of different ways for you to take action in those slides.
Thank you all so much for joining us. We'll stick around and, hopefully you all have a great rest of the day and enjoy the rest of your sessions.